If you're new, or if this is your first Sunday with us, we've been looking at this season of Lent through the lens of the 12 steps. If you or someone you know is familiar with the 12-step process for recovery, that has sort of been our guide through this Lenten season as we sort of seek to grow in our knowledge of ourselves and in our relationship with God. We've used the lectionary that offers text for each week and sort of put the two in conversation. How does that week's lectionary speak in and through the 12 steps? We've looked at steps 1 and 2 to admit that our life is a mess and that we can't save ourselves. To look at the fact that only God, something larger than ourselves, which we say in the church that only God can save us. Step 3 we looked at last week, where we look at the notion of what does it mean to give our life and our will to God, which in many cases, most days, is to say we give it away so that we don't hold such control over it that we think we're God by mistake. We give our life and our will trusting that God's care wants what's best for us. Today, we look at steps 4 and 5. If you're familiar with the 12 steps, this is where you kind of begin to do this, because this is the hard work. If you're not familiar with the 12 steps, boy, you're in for a treat. Steps 4 and 5 are hard. If you've been through the recovery process, you know how hard steps 4 and 5 can be. I am going through the recovery process in my own life, and I can tell you, working with a sponsor myself, steps 4 and 5 are really, really hard. Step 4 says that we do a thorough moral inventory of ourselves. And step 5 is that we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another person the nature of our wrongs. Woo-wee! That's some hard work. Because so much in our life we like to kind of keep bottled up as little secrets, don't we? It's much easier when there's secrets. It's like I've used this analogy before. It's like that dirty, rusty, nasty box in your garage that's in the corner. It's under a shelf. God only knows what's probably in there. You don't really know anymore. But as long as you keep the lights off in the garage and keep that box closed, you don't have to deal with it. Only that thing sits there whether you deal with it or not, and it festers and rots and festers and rots. We can turn the lights off. We can pretend like it's not there. We can pretend like everything's okay, but guess what? It might eventually start to stink. And whether we want to deal with it or not, we may eventually be in the position that we have to deal with that rotten box. The same is true in our very souls. Lent is a season. I love that it's in spring. It kind of coincides with the notion of spring cleaning, where you sort of say we got to get some things out of the house. Well, we need to get some things out of our souls on a regular basis. I'm reading one of the newer books that Anne Lamott has written, and she tells a story in the book about the nautilus shell, which is this wonderfully just God thing of symmetry that's not straight lines, but a nautilus shell is a mollusk lives inside of it, and it's this shell that has room in it that does this beautiful spiral that only God could create such beautiful symmetry. And it's made perfect for the mollusks so that the crustacean lives inside of it, but there's room for the natural gases and things that the crustacean needs to get out. There's room for that to happen in there. Now, what can happen to the nautilus shell is that the organism who lives inside of it can be put in danger when foreign things get into it and disturb this natural pattern of getting gas and various things out. In a similar way, that can happen to our souls. We're made in the image of God. As we grow and mature, we learn. We have to come to terms with the fact that by some nature of creation, all people are flawed and broken. We're sinful. And we say that sinful is not so much a moral failure as much as being sinful is to say it's a chronic disease that we carry. You can't ignore the disease, you got to deal with it. But it's not to say you're a terrible person because you sin. You're a person. When you sin, guess what? You're just human. But it's what we do with that relationship between ourselves as God made us and the brokenness that we carry at the same time. And how we deal with all of that, and then you add layer upon layer of how our family deals with us, how we grow up learning how to deal with these things, how we go off into the world and deal with them, how other relationships and traumas and other things affect the way that we deal with this nature. All of that plays into the fact that most all of us sitting here or out there in the digital world, deep down in our souls, have some sort of a mess to clean up. The 12 steps gives us a program to begin to deal with that mess. Step 4 says that we do a fearless moral inventory. That is a key word in the 12 steps, a fearless moral inventory, because that is to say, I could probably, if you asked me, tell you some things that's wrong with me, some maybe deficiencies, some character flaws, but am I going to tell you all of them? Probably not. Why wouldn't I tell you all of my defects? Because I don't want you to think less of me, which is to say I'm afraid of what would happen if I told you the whole truth. That's okay. You don't have to tell the entire world your whole truth, but you do need to tell yourself, God, and we say in step 5, another person at least, the truth in your soul. Paul writes his letter to the Romans, which is a wonderful passage to sort of talk about this process of doing this moral inventory and owning the truth about our character flaws and our sinfulness. Paul's letter to the Romans is one of the most beautiful letters in all of the New Testament. It's one of the few letters that Paul writes, they believe, that he's not like in prison and he's not dealing with like a dysfunctional church that, is at each other's throats and he's trying to be the referee and write to them about how to get over themselves and get along. His letter to the Romans is viewed by New Testament scholars as a theological treatise, a masterpiece, that he writes some of the most beautiful theology that you can imagine to the church in Rome. And one of the big things that he drives home throughout the entire letter to the Romans, and he does in today's passage, is we are saved by grace. We are saved by God's grace, which is to say, we are saved not by ourselves and our own actions and merit. You do not earn salvation. It comes as a gift from God. And you say, well, Ben, that's basic Sunday school talk. I remember that as a kid. Yeah, maybe so. You remember it here, but do we remember it in how we live every day? Because odds are, we tend to think that being righteous and things like salvation come from our good behavior more than they do as a gift from God. Just think about how we judge each other. Oh, that church person over there, look at how ugly they are on Facebook about, such and such. Christian, eh? Or we just look at how we deal with people in our own family, right? I mean, you deal with each other and how could that, they think they're so good and look at how awful they are. We make all kinds of judgments about everybody around us. But I wonder what they would say about us. And the truth is, none of it really matters because it's not by what we earn or how we behave or some scorecard we get like a kid's report card with your conduct behavior scores. It comes as a gift from God. Grace and salvation come from God. We are saved not because we are good. We are saved because God is good. And God wants to be in relationship with us. And the crux of Paul's theology in Romans is that the Christian life is about relationships, not whether or not you score right on a test. Which is beautiful because that goes right in line with what I believe is the theology of the 12 steps. That it's about relationships, not whether or not I become a perfect person in the end. Anybody who is active in their life of recovery will tell you. You ask them, are you active in your addiction? Hopefully not. Do you plan to be that way the rest of your life? They're going to say, I plan to be it today because that's all I have is one day at a time. Okay? Do you think you're a perfect person? And the person in recovery will most likely say, God, no. If anything, you become more aware of how imperfect you are. So doing steps 4 and 5 when you're in recovery can be an alarming thing because all of a sudden you unpack things in the depths of your soul that are in those festering boxes that maybe you didn't even realize were even there. Resentments that you hold, maybe even from like your childhood. Like things you resent to this day, you still play back in your head that you resent. Grudges that you carry. Fears that you have. I'm a big believer that fear is at the heart of most of our sinfulness. Most things we're afraid of, we don't even know that we're afraid of it, but we are afraid, usually fear comes up in one of two ways. We're afraid of losing something we have, or we're afraid of not getting something we think we deserve. We're afraid of losing something we have, or we're afraid of not getting something we think we deserve. Think about the ways we're jealous when somebody gets a promotion that we think, that all of a sudden we might have been up for, or maybe the promotion has nothing to do with us. They don't even work in the same field, but all of a sudden you get that little, feeling in your gut like, what did they do in their job to deserve a promotion? We're afraid, right? Because they got something we thought maybe we deserved in our life. Or here's another one. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. This idea, and preachers are the world's worst at this, so I'm chief among sinners here. Ask a preacher, do you take Sabbath? Sabbath is a day of rest, right? Most preachers will say, we have a hard time taking Sabbath. Most people do too, but preachers are uniquely bad at it, I think. To not take a day of rest, though, is speaking to fear. And you say, how's that speaking to fear? I work hard, I do all the things I need to do. Yeah, you do so much of it that you don't think you can take one day off and let God be in charge. Because you're afraid of what might happen if you let go of some control. You see how fear kind of crops up in unexpected ways? We control people in our lives. We want them to behave the way that we want them to behave. We want them to make the decision. I know what's best for you. I know that you how to run your life. Why? Well, I'm afraid if you don't do what I want you to do, then this might happen. Or maybe you're the person that's like, I'm afraid if you don't listen to my advice, then what purpose do I serve if I can't tell you what to do? And that seems trite, but for a lot of us, we worry that our lives will not have meaning if we aren't in charge of something or someone. We're afraid. But Paul says we can set aside that fear, because before we've done anything to merit it or earn it, before we've done a thing to think we're good enough for anything, Christ died for us. Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. That proves God's love toward us, we say in our communion liturgy. That there's nothing we have to do to earn salvation. That the work we do is to get out of our own way so that we can receive it. It's the analogy that if I were to take off my watch and come hand it to you, this is God's gift of salvation that God hands you. You don't take it off my wrist. God gives it. But you do have to do something. You have to reach out your hand and receive it. And that's where this work of working within ourselves to get out of our own way so that we can better be open to receiving God's grace in our lives. That's the work that we do in recovery. That's the work that we do through this notion of Lent as we examine our lives to get out of our own way to better receive God's grace. So we tell the truth. Here's the mess in my life, and I'm going to name it. We all have it. And then we tell the truth another way, and this is the hard one. We tell it to ourselves, we tell it to God, and we try to tell it to another person. You say, why do you have to do it 3 ways? That's a lot of telling of bad news. Yeah. But there's a power that this fear has over us, that what we are doing by naming it is taking its power away. That it does not have to run our lives and tell us that we're less than, or that we have to carry this grudge any longer. It does not run our lives, fear does not, that tells us that we are somehow not the person God made us to be, and here are all the reasons why. So we name it to ourselves. We name it to God. And we tell another person. Do you have someone in your life that you can be perfectly honest with? Like really honest, like brutally honest. And I don't mean brutal. When we say brutally honest, we usually mean like what we say about them. Like, can I tell you what's really wrong with you, brutally honest? No, I mean brutally honest about yourself. Do you have that person in your life? Or maybe a couple of people? I can tell you one of the greatest gifts in my life is cultivating not more friendships, but more of these accountability relationships. I have 2 or 3 people outside of even my spouse that I can sort of just say, this is what's wrong with my life. This is what's going on in my life. This is what's really bugging me and bothering me. And it doesn't mean that we fix our problems by doing that. It just means sometimes by saying it out loud in open and honest ways, it doesn't have nearly the power that it used to have. And then we don't have to do things, to sort of bury it any further. The whole issue with addiction, or one of the big issues with addiction, is oftentimes it's a means to escape. We don't like the way we feel with uncomfortable feelings, so I'm gonna engage with this addictive substance so that I can just kind of check out and escape because I don't want to deal with those feelings. And you say, well, I'm not a drinker, I'm not a drug user, I'm not an overeater, those type of things. Yeah, maybe you watch TV probably a little too much to watch terrible things to just get your mind to get away from what you're feeling. Scroll your phone. They call it doom scrolling, where you just read all the social media stuff until you feel like you're going to go crazy. Maybe you just get too busy when you don't want to deal with your feelings and you tell other people what to do in their life instead. Human beings are addictive by nature. We all have addictions. We all seek to escape uncomfortable feelings in some way or another. The key to recovery is not growing to be perfect, but growing to be self-aware, to understand yourself. John Wesley, founder of Methodism, said that we have a journey of moving on toward perfection. But perfection is not that you ace the moral quiz or test in your life. Perfection in that case is to say that you grow in a greater awareness of God's love in your life. And when you're more aware of God's love in your life, you are better able to share that love with others. But as long as this shell we live in stays clogged up with all of these character flaws and resentments and fears, we can't share God's love. So we have to name them. We have to tell ourselves, God, and another person the nature of how difficult they can be. That we're human beings who make lots of mistakes and have brokenness and sin in our life. But we do it not with a sense of doom and gloom, but we do it with rigorous honesty and aim for fearlessness. And I think we do it with hope. That as we grow in our awareness of ourselves and tell the truth about our lives, we can grow in a better awareness of God's love for us. That no, I'm not the author and salvation of my life. If I were, I'd fail. That job is not mine, it's God's. Our job is simply to open our hands more, let go of life, hold it a little more loosely, and simply be open to receive God's amazing grace. Thanks be to God. Amen.